Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. And of course, you can always listen to God Save the King on TBTRN every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as always, remember, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the nativity story the way it really would have happened. And this is, of course, because, if you've heard me before, the traditional nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance, again, to what really would have happened. And what we want to do here is we want to rescue truth from familiarity and tell the story the way it really would have happened, because number one, truth matters, and then number two, because it's a better story. As cool as everybody thinks the traditional nativity story is, it is only a pale shadow to the real nativity story. Now, if you appreciate content like this, where we get to the bottom of things and we tell the truth about biblical subjects, because one of these days, I'm going to talk about something other than nativity. Now, this is my primary thing, and it's what I'm going to do, 999 times out of 1,000. But I was actually thinking about doing a different subject today just because there was something really heavy on my heart, and I thought about changing the subject. And one of these days, you're going to tune in and hear something completely different. But my ministry, I am devoted to rescuing the truth from familiarity. I'm going to tell you what really happened and tell it like it is. Okay. So if you do appreciate content like this, would you please make sure that you like and follow and subscribe my posts, my videos, and do that both at the Truth Be Told radio network website and also at my site. And of course, also on all of our social media. So whether it's my Facebook page, TBTRN's Facebook page, YouTube, Twitch, Rumble, etc. Okay. So my website, www.godsavetheking.org, and the Truth Be Told website, www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. Okay. And once again, as always, please remember, God Save the King is based on 4 fundamental premises. Number 1, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Number 2, tradition is not evidence. Sorry, it's just not. Okay. The fact that you think you've practiced something for 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 or even 2,000 years doesn't make it true. Okay. Tradition is not evidence. And by the way, I'll prove to you that you haven't been practicing these traditions for 2,000 years anyway. So, and then next, of course, is that the traditional versions of the nativity story rarely include the historical context. Now, that's where we're headed today. We'll be right back here in just a second talking all about, okay, the historical context of the nativity, okay, in particular, the historical context of the Magi. And then finally, point number 4, the nativity is not a Christian story. Okay. Now, I know that comes as a shock to many of you, or you might even be offended hearing something like that. Well, of course, it's a Christian story. It's the birth of Jesus Christ. Christ is a Christian. Well, no, he wasn't a Christian. Jesus was a Jew. Okay. Jesus was a Jew. He was born a Jew. The Nativity is a Jewish story. Joseph was a Jew. Mary was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. And everything they would have done would have attested to the fact that they were Jewish. And by overlooking and losing the Jewish context of this, we have lost what really makes this important. I was listening to a minister that I highly respect the other day, and he, what's the word I want to use? He veered off into the nativity for a minute, and he was talking about Joseph and talking about how much courage he would have had to have shown in order to marry Mary under such very, very interesting social conditions. But his presumption was that Mary's pregnancy was publicly known, and that therefore Joseph did an outrageously courageous thing by stepping into the middle of that social, I can't use the word, that social storm, right? And and becoming and taking it on the chin, so to speak, and stepping into the middle of that melees and handling it, right? Well, the presumption there is inaccurate. I don't believe that Mary's pregnancy was ever publicly known, right? As a matter of fact, I think that's what makes the story so intriguing, is that Mary knew she could not be publicly discovered, and Joseph knew she could not be publicly discovered, which is why they moved to Bethlehem, right? Because there they could be a young married couple and no one would know any different. Anyway, I digress. We'll talk about that at a different show. A couple more little bits of business here before we jump into our full-on subject matter. You can listen to my show anytime, okay? But the new show, of course, it will always be Friday night at 10 p.m. on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. That's www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. Go to their website, click on the big listen button. And then if you have any smart device, okay, so that means a computer, of course, that means your phone, that means the Alexa, the Google Home, any of these smart devices, you can listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network simply by saying, hey, Alexa, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network, right? Apple, of course, as well. And there's a variety of applications, variety of apps that you can use. You can use the Android app, the MyTuner app, the Wi-Fi radio app, the TuneIn radio app. And these will all get you to the Truth Be Told Radio Network to listen to my show and a lot of other great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And last but not least, you can also call in 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 and listen on your phone. So if you've got unlimited long distance and you don't want to eat up your data, use your phone. Call in. All right. So let's dive into today's subject here. The past several weeks, we have started to talk about the subject of biblical archaeoastronomy. And biblical archaeoastronomy simply means, what did ancient biblical cultures know and believe about astronomy? Because we're focusing now on the record in Matthew 2, where the Magi showed up. They walk right into the court of Herod the Great, and they say, where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. And as I've mentioned before, and we'll go there again, is that this section of scripture promotes as many questions as it provides answers. Okay, what was his star? What was it, right? Now, we've already talked about that in great detail, and we will talk about it in detail more, okay? I believe it was an unprecedented series of events involving the planet Jupiter in conjunction with the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo. In other words, the king planet, the king star in the royal constellation, but that it kicked off with the heliacal rising of Jupiter in constellation with Regulus in Leo on July 29th of 3 BC. That's when it all started, and that for the next about year and about 15 months, the Magi observed, and that's a key word, they observed a highly concentrated, highly condensed series of unprecedented celestial events. And part of what makes it unprecedented is the fact that it was so highly concentrated that every time they turned around and went outside either at night or in the morning to do their morning or evening observation, there was another very significant sign involving these primary characters. Now, there were some other characters involved. There's some additional conjunctions involving other planets. There's several conjunctions with the moon. There's a couple of lunar eclipses thrown into the mix. And these were all very provocative in the minds of ancient celestial observers. And that's the key. What were they looking at? So we've been talking about what was his star. We've been talking about who were the Magi. And then last week, I spent a lot of time talking about a small handful of clay tablets in cuneiform text that help us understand who the Magi were, because even though, pardon me here, if you're watching me on video, had to scratch my nose there. These clay cuneiform texts, right? Although we may lack a large quantity of independent evidence about the Magi, in other words, you didn't have historians writing historical reference works about the Magi in 600 BC, 1000 BC, 1500 BC. You didn't have that. The reason you didn't have that is because the Magi were the historians. So the historical texts that they were writing were these cuneiform texts. So very rarely do they step back and take an objective look at themselves and say, well, we're writing about ourselves and what we're doing. No, they're just writing what they do, right? They're just writing what they do. So what we have to do is, it's pretty easy, but we just do a little bit of mild reverse engineering to translate these texts and read what's contained in these texts to therefore understand who the Magi were. Okay. Now, what we covered last week very quickly, and I'm doing this to reach a specific statement, is that we looked at one clay tablet that the tablet itself was written in approximately 700 BC. It would have been recovered from the ancient library at Nineveh in the Assyrian Empire, right? It would have been recovered in about 150 AD. No, wait a second. I'm sorry. Strike that. It would have been discovered about 150 years ago. Okay, about 150 years ago, in about 1850 AD. That's when it was discovered and retrieved. Okay, it would have been written in approximately 700 BC, but the content of the tablet causes us to understand that it is a copy of a far more ancient tablet that was likely written in 3100 BC and recorded a very significant celestial event that occurred at that time. Okay. And then we jumped forward about roughly 1500 years to approximately 1600 BC, and we looked at the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa. And the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa is a catalog of heliacal risings of the planet Venus. Now, what these two tablets demonstrate to us is that a class of highly educated celestial observer with both political and religious influence in their culture existed at least as early as 1600 BC and probably as early as 3100 BC. Now, we do not know what they were called at that time. We don't have a label for them that I am aware of. If someone knows that, please feel free to contact me and let me know. I would love that little bit of information. What do we call them? Do we call them priests? Do we call them sky watchers? Do we call them astronomers? I mean, obviously we can use those labels for our convenience, but did they have a label? Not that we know of. But then when we jump up to the third tablet that we discussed, which is a tablet in the Berlin Museum that talks about the second part, the second conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Because there is a reference to Jeremiah chapter 39, in Jeremiah 39, we have an Aramaic reference to a man whose title was Rab-Mag, Rabmag. And Rab means head or chief, and Mag is a reference to the Magi, M-A-G, Magi. So we know this man was the chief or a chief of the Magi, and he was part of the official entourage that entered the gates and occupied the middle gate of Jerusalem, according to Jeremiah 39. So we know because of that clay tablet, okay, and we know because of Jeremiah 39. Plus, when you throw in the Beashtun inscription, which we won't talk about today. We'll talk about that some other time. When you throw in the Behistun inscription, we discover that right around 600 BC is when it appears that these celestial observers, these sky watchers, these wise men began to be called Magi. That's when this label started to be used, or at least started to stick. Okay. And then when we fast forward to Matthew chapter 2, because that's where the question comes from, when we are looking at Matthew chapter 2, and Matthew says very plainly, wise men from the east, in the Greek, magoi, magi, right? Wise men from the east walked into the court of Herod the Great and said, where is he who is born king of the Jews? He is using that label in a way that presumes that his readers understand who that was. Okay. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start talking about the history of the Magi from approximately 600 BC up to the time of Christ. Okay. I say approximate because we're going to go a little bit earlier for a minute here. We're going to go back and look at something a little earlier than 600 BC. Actually, we're going to go back quite a bit further. Now, in additional episodes, I will spend time talking about the Sumerian civilization, and I will talk about the Akkadian Empire, Akkadian civilization. But for now, we're going to limit our historical context to, like I said, actually, we're going to start about 1000 BC. We're going to spend a minute right around 700 BC, and then we're going to jump up to 600 BC and move forward from there, because this is all relevant. It's all relevant to us attempting to answer the question, who were these guys? What did they see? And how did they know what to look for? How did they know, right? So we're starting to see that according to their own understanding, right, whether or not there was any Jewish influence, and that's what we're getting at today, starting to lean into today, is that there would have been, it looks like there had to have been some Jewish influence on their celestial observation, right? But we do know from the clay tablets that we have translated that the Magi paid a great deal of attention to heliacal risings, and they paid an extraordinary amount of attention to the planet Jupiter, right? So when they pop the hatch in Herod's court and say, we have seen his star in the east, we have seen his star in the rising, in its heliacal rising, that is significant. And therefore, if we look at the heliacal risings of Jupiter and Venus in and around the time that we assume Jesus was born, do we discover anything significant? And we do. We discover something extraordinarily significant in that we have, like I've said, the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus and the sun in Leo on January 29th of 3 BC, right? So I believe that that is the initial sign that the Magi are referencing when they say, we have seen his star in the rising, that's what they mean. So like I said here, let's start to put this together and start to put this into the context of, well, who were the Magi from 600 BC until Christ? Well, let's take just a moment, back up about 400 additional years, and talk about the United Kingdom of Israel under Saul, David, and Solomon. So very briefly, the first three kings of the Israelite nation after the period of the judges were Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay. And the Hebrew nation was united. It was unified. And this unity was not artificial. It was genuine, but it relied very heavily upon the strength and leadership of these three Hebrew kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And although none of them, every one of them, I should say, Saul, David, and Solomon, every one of them put their human weakness on display for eternity to see, right? Because it's recorded in the Bible, right? They just didn't put their humanity on display for history to see it. All eternity is going to see their human foibles, right? Even though they had tremendous human weakness, all three of them, they were also, each one of them, very strong and capable, if not always exemplary leaders, right? So their leadership really kept the kingdom of Israel united. And also, Israel at that time was definitely at the peak of its power. If you go back and look at the land grant that was part of the Abrahamic covenant, we discover that Israel is a little bit larger than a lot of people want to recognize. Okay. It extends from the river of Egypt, according to Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. It extends from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Okay. So that's not a small chunk of land. That's a pretty big chunk of land. And exactly where on the Euphrates? Okay. But anyway, so, but after Solomon died, okay, the nation of Israel becomes divided because you had this issue with his son Rehoboam and his antagonist Jeroboam. And that's a very important to understand Jewish history in the Old Testament. But we won't go there in depth. We'll mention a couple of things because, see, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, was young and inexperienced. Okay, and he really didn't look after the best interests of the people. He really looked after his own best interests, right? He was young, he was inexperienced, he was arrogant, and worst of all, he was prone to following bad advice. Okay. Now, his nemesis was a young leader named Jeroboam, who, according to the Talmud, was an extraordinarily gifted, superior person with an abundance of charisma. And as well, he was a great organizer and a magnificent scholar. Now, the irony is that if Rehoboam, as Solomon's son, had genuinely sought the best interest of the people, I believe it's possible that Jeroboam himself would have united with him and fallen in line and simply then be, one of Rehoboam's generals, for lack of a better word. But in one of the most colossal blunders of all time, Rehoboam ignored the sound advice of older, wiser men and listened only to the advice of younger, less experienced men who told him to deal with the people harshly. Okay. And that didn't work. And as a result, the nation divided in two. Two tribes remained loyal to the what became the southern kingdom. So that would have been Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom would have remained loyal to Rehoboam. But then Jeroboam broke off and took the other 10 tribes and created the northern kingdom with their capital at Samaria. Now, why is this important? Okay, this is why we talk about historical context. Is why is this important? What does this have to do with the birth of Christ in general, and then the history of the Magi and discovering his star in particular? Well, the reason this is important is because the Torah commands all able-bodied Hebrew males to engage in 3 pilgrimage festivals every year. Now, Jeroboam knew this, right? And therefore he feared allowing citizens of the northern kingdom to travel to Jerusalem, because that's the point. The pilgrimage festivals took you to Jerusalem. But the northern kingdom doesn't have access to Jerusalem anymore, right? So how does that work? Right? It's pretty obvious. How does that work? Does the king of the northern kingdom allow his citizens to freely travel to the southern kingdom and visit the temple and worship there and be reminded of that this should be a united kingdom? And maybe so it creates all kinds of problems, right? So as a result, what Jeroboam had to do was he had to set up an alternate form of worship okay, in the northern kingdom. And that alternate form of worship, by definition, was idolatrous because it didn't involve the temple. And it doesn't matter how good your intentions are, if you're not doing it the way Torah said, you're not doing it right, that's going to wind up being idolatry, right? So from that point forward in the southern kingdom, good and bad kings were cyclical. Every other generation or so, a good king would step forward and strengthen the faith of the people, and they'd have a really good king for a minute, right? This never happened in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom followed the mold of Jeroboam for the next 200 years, and things just went downhill, right? So what this means is that the Hebrew kingdom was no longer united, okay, because this is the divided kingdom, right? Was no longer united geographically. It was no longer united culturally, okay, right? Because they're now messing around with the culture. They're modifying the worship, right? And to a large degree, these two kingdoms now are also no longer united ethnically, because what's going to happen, what we're going to see here in a minute, is that both nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the northern nation was called Israel, the southern kingdom was called Judah, right, or Judea. They began to intermarry with other nations, right? So it's a common error. So here we go. We have to rescue the truth from familiarity. It is commonly believed that at the birth of Christ, the geographic area that we know as the nation of Israel was this homogeneous Hebrew state. And it just wasn't. It had been racked and ruined and back and forth and up and down and sideways and everything for, the past 1,000 years. They'd had a lot of problems, right? So this resulted in a yearning inside the people for the Davidic kingdom, right? Because they knew what the kingdom was like under David, and they knew the prophecies. If you were a devout Jew and you were aware of the prophecies not only made to Abraham, but now confirmed to David, the promises made to Abraham that were then confirmed to Isaac and Jacob and then Moses and then David, right? If you were aware of those prophetic promises, they were in anticipation of this kingdom that God had always promised, right? God had promised Abraham a land, a seed, and a blessing, right? The land was the geographic nation of Israel. The seed was the Hebrew people. Now it's more than that, we know that, but it was the Hebrew people. And then the blessing was going to be, they didn't know this yet, they didn't realize that the blessing was going to be the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. That's what God's intention was to choose a land of his choosing, a people of his choosing, put them in the land, and then indwell them in the land. That is the point of the Abrahamic covenant, right? So now you've got a divided kingdom, and this is very interesting. This is very interesting, frankly. I'm just going to take a second and go there. Why not? Let's go there, right? This is very interesting in light of the alternate subject that I was considering introducing today. And the alternate subject that I was going to introduce today, I was simply going to call the resurrection and the life, because I have been just overwhelmed lately. I came up with this saying, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and I've used it a lot in my other teachings and in the churches that I've been involved in and things like that, where I realized one day in the trials and tribulations of life that I said, God really only has one way of doing anything. And that one way of doing anything is called death and resurrection. And that I have seen that live and in living color like you wouldn't believe, until it finally got to the point in me where I went, well, yeah, that's really, really, really true. It really is the only way he does anything. And a big part of our evidence for that is the nation of Israel, right? Because he makes promises to Abraham that we now know, gifted by hindsight and looking backwards, we now know that these prophetic promises he made to Abraham were never going to be fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime, right? And they wouldn't be fulfilled in the days of Moses. They wouldn't be fulfilled in the days of the judges. They wouldn't be fulfilled in the days of the kings. They wouldn't be fulfilled, here we go, in the captivity, because that's what's coming. That's what's coming, is the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. So what happens to these prophetic promises when something really negative happens, right? And we can take a personal lesson from this with regard to prophetic promises in our own lives, okay? Is that the nation of Israel watched their prophetic promises get put to death and resurrected over and over and over and over and over again. Right? And that's what we are about to see here. Is we're going to briefly talk about the history of Assyria and Babylon, because they are huge players in our understanding of who the Magi were. But we wouldn't know about ready for this? We wouldn't know about the Magi as much as we do if it were not for the captivities. Okay, if it were not for the captivities, if it were not for the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, oh my word. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about Assyria for a minute here. Okay, now the Assyrian Empire was one of the greatest empires of the ancient Near East, okay? It emerged as an independent state in about the 14th century before Christ, and it dominated upper Mesopotamia until about the 9th century before Christ. And then starting in the 9th century, the Assyrian kings experienced a new period of like expansion, right? They wanted to expand the empire, and they saw a series of very, very strong kings from about the middle of the 8th century BC until the fall of the empire at the end of the 7th century BC. Okay, so the Assyrian Empire really reached its dominance from between about, here we go, like something along the nature of 850 BC until about, I take that back, about 750 BC until like about 600 BC, right? Okay. Doing BC math isn't always easy, okay? But there's a couple of things within this time frame that are very important to our subject matter, okay? And this is washing over all kinds of stuff here and really trying to simplify it. Number one of the things that was very important is the fact that Assyria, as being an upper Mesopotamian empire, nonetheless dominated southern Mesopotamia. Okay, so the Assyrians for a while were overlords to the Babylonians. Okay, now the cultures were extremely similar, so it wasn't necessarily like a master and slave thing. It wasn't that radical. But when Assyria was dominant and Babylonia was not, okay, Assyria was the overlords, and then the Babylonians, right, were kind of second fiddle, so to speak. But their cultures were extremely similar because they were both Mesopotamian cultures. And as we have noted, we've had, so this is, like I said, 750, 700 BC, there has been celestial observation all through Mesopotamia, okay, from the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and now the Assyrians and the Babylonians for a long time, right? So during the period of Assyrian dominance, a couple of things happened that are important to our story, which is that number one is that they deliberately invaded Chaldea or Chaldea, which is the southernmost region of Mesopotamia and Babylonia. Okay, so they invaded it and then they controlled it until about 625 BC. And the important thing here is it was the Chaldean dynasty of the Babylonian Empire that in turn defeated the Assyrians to become the next new superpower in the ancient Near East, which we're going to see in a minute, okay? And then also in 721 BC is when Assyria invaded and captured the northern kingdom of Israel, okay? Now they razed the capital of Samaria, and deported a significant portion of the population. Here we go, especially leading citizens, okay? And as a result, they had a very interesting foreign policy, so to speak. What they would do is that when they would conquer a foreign nation, they would take an enormous portion of the population captive and remove them from their land and transport them to other parts of their empire. Okay? So that means you have a lot of Jews that have been taken from the northern kingdom and have been transported to, what is modern, Iraq and Syria, right? And even far western Iran and things like that, okay? And then in addition, what they would do is that they would import in other vassal ethnicities from their empire into the newly conquered areas. So we don't know exactly who they moved into the northern kingdom, but they would have brought captives from other parts of their empire into the northern kingdom. And they did this obviously to dilute and to diffuse the identity of the conquered populations and thereby diminish their desire to rebel, right? And although the Israelites were now quote unquote captives in Assyria, life doesn't come to a complete standstill. Okay. Yeah, they were captives. Yes, they were slaves and things like that, but they still married and things like that. So now you've got intermarriage between the northern 10 tribes and other transplanted foreigners, right? Especially in the region known as Samaria. And this gives rise to the cultural distinction with regard to Samaritans, okay? Because the southern kingdom looked upon the northern kingdom because of this, because of the Assyrian invasion and this mixing of ethnicities that, well, okay, you had all this intermarriage in the northern kingdom. Well, you're not real Jews anymore. Okay, you didn't keep the bloodlines clean. You didn't keep the bloodlines pure. You're no longer 100% ethnically Hebrew, and therefore this stigma attached to the Samaritans. Okay, now remember, this is in 721 BC. So this is a good 100 years plus before the southern kingdom gets invaded by Babylon, right? So 100 years, that's a long time. That is a long time for them to stigmatize the northern kingdom and this mishmash of ethnicities and cultural influence and religion, and therefore what the southern kingdom perceived as idolatry going on there, right? So now, fast forward. About 100 years, roughly 100 years after the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom in 627, okay, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal died, okay? Now, he was the last of the great Assyrian kings. So when Ashurbanipal died, the result was a series of civil wars, and the Assyrian Empire very simply began to fall apart. It began to weaken, and it began to disintegrate. It's pretty much that simple. When you read the book of Nahum or Nahum, right? When you read the book of Nahum, it was very likely written in this time frame because he writes in there, the vision of Nahum and the burden of Nineveh. Okay, so Nineveh was the capital, was one of the capitals. Over the centuries, there were different capitals of the Assyrian Empire, but Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And so, Nahum is all about predicting the downfall of the Assyrian Empire and the destruction of Nineveh. And of course, if you want to know, you want to do more about the biblical connections to Nineveh, read the book of Jonah as well, and his whole thing with Nineveh. But Nineveh is really critical because there was what we called a library. Now, it's not a library in the exact same sense that we think of a library, but there was a royal library at Nineveh that had obviously been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and now we call it the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal. But my understanding is that there have been at least 30,000 clay tablets recovered from the Royal Library at Nineveh. Okay. And even though we believe that the Magi that visited Herod the Great were quote unquote Babylonian, that's really a loose term, because the royal court at Assyria, at Nineveh, would have functioned extremely similar to the royal court at Babylon. Their beliefs were extremely similar. They would have functioned the same ways. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the celestial observers in the royal court at Nineveh delivered daily intelligence briefings to their king. And a lot of what they did was that they would deliver omens to the king, and a lot of these omens came from the stars. Not all of them. They believed in omens from other sources, but a lot of what they were doing was going outside at night, reading the stars, verifying that they were in the position that they were supposed to be in, consulting these catalogs of heliacal risings and tracking Jupiter and stuff like that. And then every day they would give a intelligence briefing to the king and say, "Oh, great king, this is what we think you should do for the benefit of the empire." Okay. So even though I keep saying Assyria, 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 and the fact that the Magi that arrived at the court of Herod we don't know precisely which ethnicity they were. That's part of the problem, right? Because we're talking about a period now of 600 years from when the Assyrian Empire falls until Christ. That this is when we actually start to learn a thing or two about who the Magi are, right? And just like we mentioned about the nation of Israel a minute ago, we don't know for sure that the Magi remained ethnically pure. That wasn't even really a part of their definition. It appears that the name initially came from one of the tribes of the Median Empire. Okay. Now, the Median Empire is going to come into the picture here again in a second. It had been in the picture before, which I hadn't really mentioned, but it's going to come back into the picture here in a second. Media was a region to the northeast of the Assyrian Empire is where Media was, and Media was dominated by the Assyrians under their empire. Now, ironically, Media had been an independent nation primary to that, right? So now when the Assyrian Empire begins to disintegrate, it is a coalition of these subjugated ethnicities, the Medes, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Scythians, the Lydians. It was a coalition of these forces that number one, they started to slip out of Assyrian control. One by one, the Assyrians couldn't control them anymore. And then they began to openly rebel. And then they, like I said, they developed this coalition, and this coalition went into open rebellion, and that they all fought against the Assyrian Empire, even though it was the Babylonians that became the big gorilla on the block, so to speak. They became the next superpower. And then take note here, we won't talk about this in detail, but just so you understand who the Medes were, then when the Babylonian Empire started to crumble, it was a coalition of Persians and Medes, okay, that overcame the Babylonians. See, so you got all these different ethnicities that play roles in this, right? But one of the tribes among the Medes was apparently a tribe called the Magians or the Magians. Okay. And we know this from the works of Herodotus. The Greek historian Herodotus mentioned this, right? And what appears to have happened was that they served in the Assyrian courts. They certainly served in the Babylonian courts. There's no question about that. And it appears as if they demonstrated significant ability in these important arts that were practiced by these political and religious leaders, right? Because these men that see, and that's what we're driving at here, is that it appears that the label Magi came from the Magians, who were one tribe among the Medes. So it seems as if that maybe they just were really good at this, that they were really good at celestial observation, that they were very intelligent, that they fit the role of political and religious advisor to kings very well, to such a degree that by the time you get to about 600 BC, and certainly by the time you get to 586 BC and the second conquest of Jerusalem, that there's a class of scholar in the Babylonian court known as the Magi, known as the Magians. And we don't believe that that is simply the ethnicity anymore. This appears to be describing a job description, not an ethnicity. Okay. So we're not going to get as far today as I thought, but that's okay, because this is important information, because it helps us understand the historical background of how this all worked, right? Because as I've already mentioned, let's review real quick here. We've got clear record of the presence of a highly intelligent classification, category, class of celestial observer that also operated as political and religious advisors at least as far back as 1600 BC and probably as far back as 3100 BC, and that by the time you get to the radical changeover in power from the Assyrians, who we know that their royal advisors gave a daily intelligence briefing, and then now we're about to change over to the new superpower, which is going to be the Babylonians, and we know that their celestial observers, their wise men, also delivered daily intelligence briefings to the king, but that these wise men were known as Magi, as Magians. Okay, this appears to be when the label stuck. Okay, so now in 625 BC, due to the decline of Assyrian power, the native governor of Chaldea at the far south end, the far southeast end of Mesopotamia, a man named Nabopolassar, he became the king of Babylon by popular consent. Okay, so this inaugurated the Chaldean dynasty of the Babylonian Empire. Okay, and open rebellion and war broke out right away as soon as he became the king of Babylon, right? Assyria is still hanging on, but it's crumbling. It's going down fast. And now by popular consent, you've got Nabopolassar is the king of Babylon, right? And then, so Assyria is crumbling. All of these people groups are starting to slip out of their control. The Medes, like we've just said, they slip out of Assyrian control, and they even enjoyed a very, very brief period of independence for a minute there. But then in 612 BC, Nabopolassar destroys the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, right? He drives northwest on his military campaign, and he takes out Nineveh. And it's a coalition of forces. It's Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, Cimmerians, etc. So with Nineveh destroyed, the Assyrians moved their capital to Haran. Okay, now there's a biblical name that everybody will recognize. They moved their capital, right? But then in 610 BC, the Babylonians overrun Haran. Okay, so once again, the Assyrians move their capital again. They move it to a place called Carchemish. And the reason I bring up Carchemish is because Carchemish winds up is a battle that is mentioned in Scripture, and it is one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. Is the Battle of Carchemish. So once the Assyrians moved their capital to Carchemish, Nabopolassar actually left military operations in the hands of one of his very capable generals, who also happened to be his son. And Nabopolassar went home, went back to Babylon, right? Okay. So now to give us this biblical touch point, here we go. All right. When the Assyrian Empire is reaching its final downfall, they appealed to the Egyptians for military aid, right? So in 606, 605 BC, King Josiah of Judah, that is the southern kingdom, right, was killed during a battle at Megiddo, okay, the plains of Megiddo, Har Megiddo, right? Which, by the way, if you transliterate that out of Hebrew into English, quote unquote, Har Megiddo is where you get Armageddon. Okay. So, and Megiddo it's actually in the Northern Kingdom geographically, but it is a great place for a battle. It's a great place for a staging area for armies, right? Because what Josiah did was he was attempting to delay the Egyptian forces of Pharaoh Necho from aiding Assyria. So he went out to battle, and he was actually killed at a battle of Megiddo in 606, 605 BC. But that's moving towards this battle of Carchemish, right? So later on that same year, it's not very long later, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Necho at the Battle of Carchemish, right? And so, and Carchemish is on the Euphrates River near the modern Syrian Turkish border. So you can see how far west they have come, right? So this victory made Babylon the uncontested dominant power in the ancient Near East at that time, okay? Now, interestingly enough, right about this same time is when Nebuchadnezzar gets word that his father, Nabopolassar, has died, which makes Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon. And oh, by the way, you recognize that name, right? Yeah, this is the Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible, of the book of Daniel, that we are going to talk about, because we're running out of time, that we're going to talk about primarily next week. But this is the setup, right? This is the setup for Daniel is going to serve in the Babylonian court. And what is Daniel's job in the Babylonian court? Well, he's a wise man. He's an intelligent guy, right? We all know the story about how Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams, and no one can interpret the dream for him. And because Daniel falls in the same job classification, he's going to suffer the same fate as the other wise men if they can't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, we're going to get a lot more into that next time, because obviously we spent today talking almost exclusively about the Assyrian Empire. So we'll just save Babylon for next time. So as a matter of fact, that's a good place to stop. We'll just stop right there. So my name is Tim Keyes. I am your host of God Save the King. Remember, you can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told radio network. Please like, follow, and subscribe to my posts and my videos. www.godsavetheking.org or www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, plus our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Rumble, things like that. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you listening in. My name is Tim Keyes with God Save the King.